I want to briefly introduce our speaker today, Dr. Hilary Laga Kirkham. So Dr. Kirkham she received her PhD in cultural studies at Claremont Graduate University just earlier this year, actually, a newly minted PhD. And we're excited to hear some, fresh off the dissertation research today. She also did her master's degree at Claremont, and prior to that did her bachelor's degree in sociocultural anthropology at none other than Brigham Young University. In fact, particularly excited today, Hilary was one of the very first students that I taught in multiple courses and sort of advised in the senior thesis project. She did a very interesting, back in those days, we didn't have all of these, we didn't have the range of field schools, and it wasn't required to go on a field school. Hilary managed to negotiate her way into an Amish community in Ohio to do fieldwork there, and it was a fantastic project that she'd undertaken there. She has been a research associate at Harvey Mudd College. She has a lot of museum experience, as we're going to hear about in her presentation today. She's been currently a curatorial fellow at the Museum of Mormon Mexican History here in Provo. She's been an exhibition intern in the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City, as well as a number of other places, including the Autry Museum of the American West, as well as our own Museum of Art here at BYU. And she's been funded by entities like the Mormon History Association and the Friedman Grant at Claremont. So we're really excited to have Dr. Hilary with us today and to hear about her work. I'll let you do your own title, but it's about something that I think all of us need to know a little bit more about the Manzanar internment camp. So join me in giving a digital applause for Dr. Hilary Laga Kirkham. Over to you.
Okay, now share my screen. Should work. Okay. Yeah, so my talk today is called Participatory Memorialization, Constructing Meaning at Manzanar National Historic Site. Located in the desert of East Central California, Manzanar is one of 10 desolate camps where the US government forcibly relocated and incarcerated around 120,000 people of Japanese descent during World War II. Manzanar alone housed 11,070 Japanese American internees. While the bombing of Pearl Harbor might have been the catalyst, internment was not a sudden, rash decision made in the heat of war. The ground had been prepared. Anti-Asian sentiments and racism have been brewing in America for many years prior. While this racism is no doubt rooted in the larger system of imperialism and colonialism that pervaded Western society for centuries, specific examples of racism in America against people of Asian descent were largely tied to labor and concerns about economic competition. While anti-Asian sentiments permeated the nation, legally supported racism came in 1882 when Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. As the name suggests, this act only affected those from China. And America continued to allow Japanese immigration because there was still a demand for cheap labor, especially agricultural. Over time, however, resentment began to grow towards Japanese immigrants. Again, labor is at the forefront, bolstered by racist claims. Japanese immigrants enjoyed farming success and began to cultivate their own farms and build their own stores instead of working for whites. Each success brought additional backlash through additional restrictions concerning land ownership, citizenship, or immigration. Eventually, this competition led to the Immigration Act of 1924, which barred all Asian immigration. Fears concerning Japan's power compounded the racism and prejudice towards people of Japanese descent in the United States. After Japan's upset victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, there were worries of a so-called yellow peril. While this fear subsided somewhat during World War I, it ramped up again when tensions between America and Japan heightened in the 1930s. The relationship between Japan and America caused the government to fear disloyalty by both Japanese American immigrants and their children born in the US. In fact, even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the government was already planning for internment camps. The press exploited the nation's fears and racism, bolstering anti-Japanese sentiment. By the time Pearl Harbor occurred, the stage was already set. Originally constructed by the government as a temporary assembly center to house internees before they were sent to more permanent camps, Manzanar became one of the internment camps when the War Relocation Authority assumed governance on June 1st, 1942, and it remained in operation until November 21st, 1945. Memorialization efforts at Manzanar did not begin until the late 1960s, but it was not until the 1990s that the US government contributed to the efforts. On one level, the delay in memorialization is not uncommon in the United States. A Manzanar memorialization could be compared to other shameful events in America, whether that be lynching or Native American massacres or violent labor disputes. While most sites of trauma require some period of reflection to determine their meaning, the United States government is not necessarily known for discussing or memorializing events that depict the nation in a negative light. The government is not the only reticent party. Many citizens resist efforts to address unsavory part of the nation's history. The recent uproar over Confederate monuments shines a light on the continuing failure to acknowledge, let alone atone for, grave injustices. Often, this reticence stems from long entrenched white supremacy and the larger way in which America sees itself as perpetually innocent. However, unique concerns complicated efforts to memorialize Manzanar. Beyond a governmental and societal difficulty in confronting shameful history, Manzanar poses an especially problematic dilemma as a wartime site that does not fit into a Manichaean view of war, where there's a simple and clear fight between the good guys and the bad guys. Most American war sites are steeped in patriotic sentiment, evoke themes of bravery or in heroism, and espouse this reductive narrative. But Manzanar complicates an image of the United States that fought against an enemy which, among other aggressions, targeted its own citizens based on identity. Furthermore, as Donna K. Nagata points out, quote, at the same time that Japanese Americans were living in concentration camps and considered hazardous to national security, 23,000 additional Japanese Americans, including relatives of those in camps, served in the US military during World War II, protecting the American ideals of equality, justice, and democracy, end quote. Compounding these issues preventing national memorialization was a marked silence by those formerly incarcerated as well. There are a number of reasons for this silence. The desire for assimilation played a part, as did internalized shame. Ultimately, though, the silence was deeply rooted in trauma. Historian Alice Yang Murray explains that, quote, a growing number of Japanese Americans soon began to reevaluate the silence as evidence of psychological trauma or psychological damage caused by internment. By the late 1980s, there would be a consensus among activists and scholars that many internees found it too painful to confront their memories of life in the camps, end quote. By and large, student activism ultimately contributed to and allowed for the memorialization at Manzanar. Younger generations questioned narratives and confronted silence, both of their government and of their relatives. Their activism spurred a turn to and a reevaluation of the past. This remembrance effort was catalyzed by political activism in the United States that emerged during the late 1960s. The Asian American movement developed during this time, drawing on other contemporaneous activism, including the Black Power movement. Confronting silence and bringing stories of internment into the present led to a physical return to Manzanar and memorialization of the site. With the exception of a Buddhist priest and a Christian minister, who returned to Manzanar each year since the closing of the camp, the site did not become a site of ritualized site of remembrance until 1969, when a group of Japanese Americans traveled to Manzanar. After this initial pilgrimage, the Manzanar Committee formed. Over the years, this committee not only returned annually to the site, but also worked to get Manzanar recognized on a variety of historical registers. Eventually, the creation of Manzanar as a National Historic Site on March 3rd, 1992, came from the joint efforts between the US government and the Japanese American community. While the committee still assists with the pilgrimage, today the National Park Service runs the site, which includes a museum called the Interpretive Center, as well as a demonstration block that includes 2 reconstructed barracks, a reconstructed bathroom, and a relocated mess hall. Driving along Highway 395 in California, it is easy to miss the exit to Manzanar National Historic Site. While there are road signs, Manzanar is off the beaten path and, perhaps with the exception of a lone guard tower, does not readily catch drivers' attention. One's first introduction to the site is a bit underwhelming as well. To be sure, the barren landscape is disarmingly beautiful, flanked by the Sierra Nevada mountains. However, the location at first glance looks like a rest stop, complete with picnic tables and a rather large empty parking lot. The location and appearance of Manzanar National Historic Site exemplify an overarching issue: absence and presence. The largely empty landscape belies an astonishingly deep and dark history. The site reveals the paradoxical nature of absence, simultaneously full and devoid of meaning. Issues of absence and presence surround Manzanar National Historic Site and intersect with interesting questions surrounding the role of visitors in the memorialization process. Specifically, this talk examines how absence at Manzanar, whether that be a profound lack of physical structures or a manufactured amnesia in US memory, invites important questions about individuals' roles at the site and beyond. Instead of being a detriment to memorialization, I argue that absence invites visitor participation and allows for different modes of engagement. In contemporary memorialization, absence is a common trope. Through abstract expressions of grief, rather than the grand and glorifying monuments commonly found at war memorials, designers represent concepts such as loss. This representation of absence is commonly seen in Holocaust memorials, such as Daniel Liebeskind's Voids in the Jewish Museum, Berlin, but it appears in memorializations of more recent tragedies, such as the National September 11th Memorial, with its waterfalls into the footprints of the fallen towers, or the empty chairs of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. However, in key ways, absence at Manzanar National Historic Site is unique. Absence does not represent an abstract concept or used solely metaphorically. Rather, the absence is profoundly literal. Following the camp's closure, the government dismantled the camp, both selling some barracks to veterans and then destroying the remaining structures. Manzanar National Historic Site thus embodies what Marita Strickland terms an absent presence. Here, the site calls attention to absence by identifying what used to be present. A 3-mile self-guided tour, which follows a loop around the perimeter of the site, invites visitors to explore by foot or car. Those walking at Manzanar are allowed to traverse the interior of the site, sprawling, which includes elements such as orchards, a judo dojo, and garden remnants. Occasionally, visitors have to walk through the untamed flora to get to a location, including trekking through wild brush complete with thorns. Visitors can stop at interpretive spots associated with significant structures. Sometimes a descriptive sign is visible, but in each instance, visitors are essentially staring at empty land covered in native brush. A closer look might reveal reminders that the land was once occupied, such as a baseball base or foundation markers, but often a single sign is all that signifies the original structure. Taken as a whole, Manzanar National Historic Site remembers 2 layers of Japanese internment: the camp experience itself, as well as the attempted erasure of that shameful event in American history. Absence bears strongly on memorial practices at Manzanar. In a critical way, the site is incomplete without visitors. While memorialization fundamentally always requires people to make meaning, certain memorials are not truly complete without physical interaction. For example, Menashe Kadashman's memorial, Fallen Leaves, at the Jewish Museum, Berlin, requires people to walk across a sea of abstract metal faces, mashing the iron pieces against one another to produce a clanging sound that reverberates against the towering concrete walls. Likewise, Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial symbolizes a scar in the land, but it truly becomes meaningful when people touch the names, leave objects, or see the Washington Memorial reflecting off the glassy black stone. Manzanar, too, works because of bodily movement at the site itself. Moving through the site creates meaning. Conversely, the physical site itself spurs experiences and memories that would not be possible elsewhere. Even without many material remains, the physicality of the site is crucial to memorialization. In short, bodies fill in absences at Manzanar, but Manzanar's physicality provides necessary components for memorialization. The participatory aspect of Manzanar does not merely occur once visitors arrive at the site. Rather, participatory memorialization begins by traveling to the site itself. The journeying is most evident in the Manzanar pilgrimage. Every April, on the last Saturday of the month, thousands participate in the Manzanar pilgrimage, traveling miles to gather at the site. Pilgrimage is often associated with religion and adherents' desire to pay respects at a significant location, and in many ways, the Manzanar pilgrimage retains the sacred element at the site. The pilgrimage involves an interfaith service held at a white obelisk called the Soul Consoling Tower that was built during interment. During the pilgrimage, the crowd gathers around the obelisk, participating in either Christian or Buddhist prayers, and then lay flowers at the base. Outside of the overt religious definition, though, the pilgrimage transforms Manzanar into a sacred site. The dedicated journey to a specific place sets the site apart from other locations. Moreover, the pilgrimage transforms participants as well. The journey is both physical and metaphysical, the trek shaping identity and building a sense of community. It is a ritual performance, at once directed towards a larger goal and a generative process in its own right. As one founder of the Manzanar Committee, Sue Kunitomi Embry, argued, quote, "The most important contribution was that we kept the issue alive, not only with the mainstream public, but also with Japanese Americans," end quote. Even outside the official Manzanar pilgrimage, there is certainly a pilgrimage-like aspect to visiting Manzanar that works to memorialize the event. According to historian Sarah Farmer, the religious scholar Alphonse Dupont differentiates pilgrims and tourists through this distinction. Quote, "The pilgrim, by definition, seeks a fixed sacred goal, a spiritual summit," end quote. Conversely, tourists visit a particular site without prioritizing it, or selecting, as she explains, quote, "any point of the journey as the high point before departure," end quote. The intentionality that comes from traveling to Manzanar, almost a 4-hour drive from Los Angeles, frames the experience differently. Even without participating in the official pilgrimage, the decision to visit and actually travel to Manzanar creates and imparts meaning to the space. There is something significant about a space being physically isolated and, by virtue of this separation, literally and figuratively set apart. As one visitor wrote in the comment guestbook, quote, "The 6-hour ride here this morning provided time for reflection and feel very moved by the now solemnity of this place," end quote. The journey itself became a vital part of the experience. But why does one need to physically travel to and experience the site, the actual site of Manzanar? At its core, place and memory are bound up in one another and have been for centuries. This connection harkens back to the Greeks and their so-called art of memory, said to have originated with the poet Simonides of Chios. As the story goes, Simonides identified the bodies of dinner guests smashed when a roof collapsed at a dinner party because he remembered their seating arrangements. Even today, mnemonic devices frequently employ place, such as the memory palace, in which individuals visualize what they want to remember in different areas of a house and then mentally walk through it, encountering each object as they go through. Other scholars also link the two. For example, Maurice Halbach emphasized the fundamental importance of place for memory, arguing that, quote, "Every collective memory unfolds within a spatial framework. We can understand how we recapture the past, not only by understanding how it is, in effect, preserved by our physical surroundings," end quote. Place is foundational to the formation of our memories, even those that we create. The sightedness of Manzanar does not automatically connect the mind to memory, however. A corporeal physicality is involved in memorialization. Put differently, there is an intimate connection between bodies and memory that comes to bear on the memory-making experience. As Marita Sturken argues, throughout history, the body has been perceived as a receptacle of memory, from the memory of bodily movement, such as walking, to the memory of past events and physical scars, to the memory of one's genetic history in every cell, end quote. Given the association between bodies and memory, it makes sense to have what Paul Williams calls rituals of visiting. While there's not a specific destination in mind when exploring Manzanar, the slow movement through the space encourages visitors to think about the past and what occurred there. And here's just a little dance. Of course, the relationship of visitors to the site or event changes how bodies physically connect to the site. Former internees will connect differently than tourists. Part of this has to do with memories of the site itself. Some in the government interned will remember the experience of being physically controlled, so the freedom to walk around the site carries with it a different significance than a tourist who has no conception of what that was like. Location itself also plays a role. For victims, there is a sensory component that comes alive at the site in question. As Paul Williams explains, quote, Location affords not only the ability to picture the traumatic episode, but to reawaken the feeling of an event triggered by ambient textures of sound, light, and smell, end quote. So, while my visits were certainly meditative, for many personally connected to internment, physically moving through the space is key to the visiting experience. In these cases, there's a sense of power involved with this physical act. As Floyd Chung argues, quote, former internees, their descendants and allies, increasingly have visited or returned to the sites of wartime internment camps, and by doing so, they've begun to manage the meaning and memory of an experience over which they initially had no control, end quote. During the years of internment, their movement was limited and their bodies literally policed. So visiting today and freely moving through the space allows for a physical repossessing of place and a symbolic assertion of power. Movement allows for a new relationship to the past. Going to Manzanar, however, does not automatically ensure that visitors will participate in a meaningful experience. For instance, in a key way, the site enables people to avoid bodily encounters. The fact that visitors can drive the path mediates the visit, and inhibiting tactile experiences. A car removes the meditative walking that ritual of visiting the site invites, but it also creates a literal barrier between visitors and Manzanar. Drivers cannot traverse the interior, thus missing the bulk of the camp, but they also miss potentially difficult to see remnants that require closer inspection. During one visit, as I stood in the old baseball field, multiple cars rolled past me without even stopping. On a more theoretical level, by driving, visitors mentally separate themselves from the camp and, accordingly, what happened there. In some ways, it echoes what Marita Sturken calls a tourist of history. Speaking about the aftermath of 9/11, Sturken details how visitors to Ground Zero bought souvenirs like snow globes and teddy bears in order to avoid grappling with that difficult reality and the emotions that such a horrifying event brought up. While visitors to Manzanar are not mediating their experience through kitschy memorabilia, as they might have at Ground Zero, the car likewise creates a different experience that limits confrontations with a difficult event. As Sturken argues, we live in a comfort culture, and this culture, quote, functions as a form of depoliticization and as a means to confront loss, grief, and fear through processes that disavow politics, end quote. There is, of course, a distinct difference between Sturken's discussion of comfort objects that provide a sense of reassurance that things will be okay in a world in which terrorists attack major metropolises and using a SUV to explore a former internment camp. However, there is a similar refusal to fully confront pain and, in the case of Manzanar, shame. Visitors become more passive viewers than active seekers as they drive on the asphalt, shielded from the hot sun and dusty wind in their vehicles. Physically moving through Manzanar National Historic Site is more than a ritual or meditative experience. In conjunction with the site's creators, visitors can play an active role in recovering the past as they move through the space. This can be seen by looking at how Manzanar invokes absence, specifically the nation's manufactured amnesia, through the form of burial. This burial is both literal and figurative, a point noted by the National Park Service in their brochure, which reads, quote, as time passed, Manzanar was further buried both in sand and in memory, end quote. Not only are significant structures like the internee constructed gardens buried, but people forgot what happened in the desert over 75 years ago. The language of burial is also used by Japanese Americans as well. In filmmaker Tadashi Nakamura's documentary Pilgrimage, there is a language of digging and buried used repeatedly when talking about the past. One former internee, Robert Nakamura, remarks that, quote, even though I was in camp, I really buried the experience. I very seldom thought about it, and that was very easy because I didn't want to talk about it. My parents didn't want to talk about it. The whole Nisei generation didn't want to talk about it, end quote. The pilgrimage experience was critical to digging up the past. As one participant interviewed in the documentary noted about the power of the experience, quote, and unlocked what I had buried, end quote. Through this language, there is a stated need to end the silence about internment and expose lost stories. The National Park Service calls attention to how the U.S. simply tried to move on from their treatment of Japanese Americans, this metaphorical burial of the past, not only through the lack of reconstruction at Manzanar, but also by identifying where previous structures once stood. Through both signs and drawings on maps, the National Park Service points out and highlights now empty space. For example, at one spot it's a wooden sign that reads Catholic Church, but all the visitor sees is dirt, dry brush, and scraggly trees. Because Manzanar uses the pre-existing ruins and landscape to highlight an attempted destruction of memory, Manzanar necessitates visitor participation in the memorialization process. Visitors at Manzanar are asked to actively remember what happened there. For example, they are prompted to uncover the camp, a move encouraged by the brochure given to visitors, which reads, quote, "Today, when visitors see Manzanar, they may think there is nothing out there. Yet for those who learn how to read the landscape, the place comes to life," end quote. The brochure provides instructions for how to read Manzanar's landscape, which directs visitors to look for things like rock arrangements, sidewalks, water pipes, and foundations. The idea of uncovering or reading or finding complicates the absence at Manzanar because it's obvious that many of the structures are actually gone, razed when the camp closed. In this instance, absence is a somewhat temporary position as reading becomes a performative act. As the explanation in the brochure continues, quote, "A pipe sticking out of the ground becomes a water faucet where children splash their faces in the summer heat. A foundation reveals the shoe prints of a child who crossed wet cement. 10 rings embedded in the concrete slab evoke the humiliation of 10 women forced to sit next to strangers during private moments on public toilets," end quote. What seems to be happening then is that visitors look at Manzanar's fragmented remains and use them to imagine what life was like for the internees. Other scholars similarly argue for the role of performativity at Manzanar. Floyd Chung, for instance, posits that, quote, "Revisiting Manzanar now is like walking onto an empty stage, albeit one layered with memories," end quote. What appears to be happening then is that Manzanar provides the space for this imaginative reconstruction to occur, helping bring the past into the present. Absence allows for personal meaning and memory making. However, while absence invites personal interpretation, Manzanar is not by any means devoid of institutional narratives. The fact that there even is a Manzanar National Historic Site run by the National Park Service signifies that the US government is willing to acknowledge on a national level its grievous mistake and that is willing to complicate a generally honorific narrative of World War II by recognizing our government's own use of concentration camps. Furthermore, the aptly named Interpretive Center is quite explicit about the meaning and interpretation it desires visitors to come away with, namely, that the internment of people of Japanese descent during World War II was racist and unconstitutional, that the government made a horrible error, and that such behavior must never happen again. Even though absence infuses Manzanar with meaning, this absence in the demand for participatory meaning making means that sometimes people do not suffuse the site with the so-called intended meaning. There is certainly the possibility to look at the absence at Manzanar and deny what happened at camp. This interpretive reading of the site occurred during the 1990s as work began to open Manzanar to visitors. Some residents of the area denied the existence or function of certain camp structures, contending that there was only a fire watchtower instead of the 8 guard towers. Worse still, some argued against the nature of internment, insisting that people could leave at any time. Supporting this argument that internees were not forcibly confined, the revisionists deny the existence of extensive barbed wire fences, instead arguing that there was only minimal barriers designed to keep out cattle. This resistance to Manzanar's true history illustrates how absence can be read differently. While some visitors see the lack of structures and not only imagine what camp looked like during World War II, but also envision how the government tore down the structures, others view the absence supporting a different version of the past. Some guestbook comments similarly reflect these alternative interpretations. While rare to see explicit support of internment, it is present and it's important to examine. For instance, one comment reads, "I honestly think the Japanese deserved this." Other commenters rationalized the situation, emphasizing the historical context. One commenter exclaimed, "How typical it seems to me to have the younger generations slam their fist and protest another issue about which they know nothing. You weren't there. You can't appreciate the time." This comment, while not outright supporting internment, lacks any remorse. More often, we see a cognitive dissonance as visitors will admit the error or acknowledge the trauma, will simultaneously try to make sense of or justify the government's decision. Historical context becomes a way to offset shame. Here's a small sample. The government did what they had to secure our nation's future. Wrong it may have been, but it's over now. Fear is a difficult motivation. The unprecedented attack on Pearl Harbor vaulted the United States out of its isolation into a war it had assiduously tried to avoid participating in. The camps were a knee-jerk reaction to fear that does not justify the reaction, but at least provides some understanding to the grievous mistake. This is really sad. However, so is Pearl Harbor. Let's not forget that too. Again, no Pearl Harbor, no Manzanar. I'm still a good American and I love my country. By constructing a yes but interpretive structure, explaining the government's decision-making serves as a way to reduce fault. Furthermore, the focus on Pearl Harbor as a historical context elides a discussion on the government's incarceration of American citizens. Other comments do not deny the awfulness of what people of Japanese descent went through while incarcerated, but do compare atrocities on a sliding scale that diminishes internees' experiences. This interpretation similarly tries to reduce shame. For example, it's understandable if we are at that time of history. For me, these hardships are much less painful than what we had been through during 1975 to 1988 in a Vietnam communist government. Although holding the Japanese against their will, they were educated and fed and had medical treatment in these camps. They were not treated as bad as the Jews. They had it good compared to my dad and many others who languished in POW camps enduring slave labor, starvation, beatings, etc. All these comments, along with the rewriting of history discussed earlier, are troubling and potentially dangerous. We see how people still circulate incorrect narratives, dismiss trauma, and possess ideologies that could support future injustices. It's difficult to say that these commenters are speaking out of ignorance, given that the Interpretive Center provides ample historical context of longstanding racism and media-flamed hysteria that predated the attack on Pearl Harbor. Some responses seem defensive, whether that be attempting to explain the government's reasoning or minimizing the camp's conditions. Without background information on the commenters or follow-up interviews, it is difficult to fully analyze the responses or determine motivation. That being said, these comments reveal visitors participating in the meaning-making process. While the absence of Manzanar National Historic Site might suggest many interpretive possibilities, it is already quite filled in, so to speak. There is an authoritative narrative embedded within the site that influences how visitors interact in the space and what they take away from their visit. The shock from these anomalous comments reveals that interpretive presence. Finally, the National Park Service influences visitors' understanding of the internment camp through the ways in which it invokes identity. Manzanar National Historic Site diverges from other memorial museums that attempt to foster an intimate connection between victims and visitors. For example, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum intended for its identification card program to create personal, emotional, and empathetic connections. The museum explicitly states on its website, quote, handed to visitors at the entrance to the permanent exhibition, the museum's identification cards help personalize the events of the Holocaust, end quote. However, the Manzanar National Historic Site avoids such a device. We might ask, why would the creators want to deny visitors identifying or empathizing with internees, especially since this identification is so prevalent at other memorial sites or museums dealing with distant past? One compelling explanation is that preventing identification with victims actually emphasizes pre-existing connections, namely that Japanese internment happened in the United States and that 2/3 of internees were American citizens. There is thus an invisible presence underlying the site. One powerful technique employed at Manzanar, the Interpretive Center's ID tag program, prevents identification with victims while simultaneously encouraging visitors to recognize that they are not completely disconnected from internment. Near the beginning of the exhibition, there's a small wall of ID tags next to a photograph. Here, visitors choose from 10 ID tags designed to look like the tags that people of Japanese descent were, as the wall text explains, quote, required to attach to their clothing and baggage during transport to the camps, end quote. Then, visitors find the corresponding tag in the exhibition attached to a particular item to learn more about an individual. Manzanar differs from the Holocaust Museum's identification card program because visitors are not asked to embody their character, and the purpose is not to discover an individual's fate. Instead, the museum's exhibition text notes that the tags highlight stories of the selected internees. The deliberate use of a tag instead of a card is key in differentiating the two experiences as well. The identification card is connected to a Holocaust victim's personal identity, It marks who they are and where they came from. In contrast, the ID tag is a step removed because it is connected to an object belonging to an internee. There is still linkage and identification, but not nearly to the same level. Assuming the identity of an internee would suggest the need to form a connection, but by limiting this embodiment, the ID tag program forces visitors to recognize that one already exists. The pre-existing connection between visitors and internees is carried further elsewhere at Manzanar, but gains a more activist bent. In their mission statement, the National Park Service declares that, quote, the park stimulates dialogue and greater understanding of civil rights, democracy, and freedom. One meaning imposed on the site, then, is the fundamental importance of those pillars of American society and, ostensibly, the need to protect them. One way of conveying this understanding is through, paradoxically, an environment that situates non-internee visitors as perpetrators. Put differently, the site enables visitors to see themselves in a position of culpability, an uncomfortable position that will hopefully inspire them to resist such behavior in their everyday lives. As mentioned earlier, the absence at Manzanar requires visitors to mentally reconstruct Manzanar. However, more than uncovering the past, this imaginative experience is not necessarily neutral. In one way, it enables visitors to think about what it would have been like to create an internment camp. Through imagining the site as it was during World War II, guests are, in a sense, creating the site again. Japanese internment occurred on American soil and was perpetuated by Americans less than 100 years ago. It is relatively easy to make that mental connection. While identifying as a perpetrator might seem problematic, it is key to recognize that the site does not encourage victims to become perpetrators. Rather, it sends a message that is instructive to recognize the potential in oneself, as difficult as it may be. As Dominic LaCopra argues about the Holocaust, quote, the inability to recognize oneself, at least potentially, in Himmler may derive from an insufficient insight into the self, from what may be radically disorienting or even blinding if it is seen. In other words, it may be due to repression or even to the denial of the other within oneself. But an awareness or recognition of the other, to the extent it is desirable, in no sense entails affirmation or acceptance. On the contrary, it requires vigilance and the mounting of conscious resistance to deadly tendencies that are fostered but never simply determined by certain historical conditions whose genesis should be consorted in every legitimate manner, end quote. If one goal of the site is to never let internment happen on American soil, again, it is imperative that visitors understand that it is certainly possible that it could. If internment is in the realm of imagination, or someone can recognize a negative tendency within themselves, they can more readily fight against the injustices they might see. There is greater vigilance to fight prejudice within oneself and to call it out when it is seen. Visitor comments would suggest that Manzanar National Historic Site succeeds in creating a conversation and understanding of civil rights, democracy, and freedom, as stated in its mission statement, as well as encouraging visitors to fight against intolerance. In Manzanar, people apply the lessons of internment to current political situations. Connections between the past and the present, and calls for action, are evident in the comment books at the site. This engagement is not a new phenomenon. It has been visible since the opening of the Interpretive Center in 2004. For example, visitors in the first guest book from April 2004 to June 2004 wrote comments such as, makes one think about this Patriot Act and knee-jerk legislation. George W. Bush has re-entered us into a time that will be looked back on as even worse than the 1940s for dismissal of human rights and liberties. The internment was wrong, Iraq is wrong, and Guantanamo is wrong. In a more recent guest book from September 2017 through June 2018, visitors likewise brought up current events, especially those related to immigration and persecution of minorities. Furthermore, there's frequently an activist bent to these comments. For example, "Oh, America, how little we learn from history. In the year 2018, we are on the verge of repeating mistakes that led us to the atrocity that is Manzanar. Immigrant fear, racial prejudice, political propaganda, and the cruel side of humanity has once again led our country to a place where we look to punish and turn our backs to people who wish to immigrate here. It is my hope that Americans never again go down this path. I stand with immigrants, protect our dreamers. America, let's be better." May we not sit idly by and watch as history repeats itself. Have we not learned that one cannot judge another based on the color of their skin? There is injustice in silence. It is up to each of us as individuals to make the choice to be active and present in the betterment of our country. Show up, speak out, call your representatives, have difficult conversations, learn, petition, protest, use your voice to speak for those who do not have one. It is not our leadership's fault alone if we are not active in shouting out our disapproval. Fight and give them hell. What is interesting in these comments, and others in the book, is that culpability is both collective and individual. While multiple comments by visitors point to President Trump or the US government as the source of current problems or the potential perpetrator of another internment, many people call on both individual citizens or America collectively to stand up and do better. There is a clear ability to see the faults in our country and a warning to be vigilant so it does not occur again. However, identification works differently for Japanese American visitors. Many of these visitors were interned themselves or have relatives interned at Manzanar or other camps. As one self-identified visitor of Japanese American descent wrote in a comment book during the 2018 pilgrimage, oh my gosh, I'm like, oh, off. Sorry about that. Jumped. Oh my gosh. Going too fast. I take this day to remember my grandfathers and grandmothers who spent years here. Manzanar is my family's history as much as it is America's history. Those without a direct personal connection to internment might still feel a sense of belonging and alliance because the government targeted those in their racial or ethnic community. As another person wrote in the comment book, as an Asian American, I wasn't really able to learn the plight of my community until college. I was appalled and startled. How can a country that I call my own do this to my people? Even more than this individual experience and empathetic response, there is a profound collective identity that emerges in the act of visiting Manzanar. Participants in the annual pilgrimage, especially the founders of the Manzanar Committee, remark about the sense of community that emerges from these visits. As one man remarked in Nakamura's documentary, quote, "It was not only coming back to Manzanar, but I think being with all these people. It is the first time I felt like I belonged to community," end quote. Today, Manzanar National Historic Site, born out of efforts for social change, remains a site of fervent activism. For instance, the Manzanar pilgrimage transcends purely religious overtones to transform memory into a political tool. When I attended the pilgrimage in 2018, the Reverend both evoked God and Jesus throughout, while referencing historical events and current issues. The prayer points became a call to action, from remembering past injustices, to honoring victims, to pleading for peace and unity. Beyond the interfaith service, the pilgrimage ceremony itself was filled with politics. More specifically, the pilgrimage involves an activist mission connected to protecting the rights of minorities and ensuring internment never happens on US soil again. This activism at Manzanar Historic Site is rooted in the site's origins, but can also be tied to material absence. Memorialization scholar James Young contends that, quote, "In this age of mass memory production and consumption, in fact, there seems to be an inverse proportion between the memorialization of the past and its contemplation and study. For once we assign monumental form to memory, we have to some degree divested ourselves of the obligation to remember. In shouldering the memory work, monuments may relieve viewers of their memory burden," end quote. While Manzanar National Historic Site includes the Interpretive Center, the abundant absences at the site require that visitors shoulder the memory work. Furthermore, the absence actually allows memory to more readily apply to present-day issues. The site does not merely memorialize the event, but rather allows for a more open, meaning-making experience. Interpretation is not limited to internment alone, but rather extends to discussions surrounding related topics such as American values, political leadership, and personal responsibility. Manzanar National Historic Site provides a unique perspective into how absence and presence play a role in memorialization. In this case, participation becomes a vital part of the remembrance and meaning-making process. Manzanar's absence is not a detriment, but rather invites personal interpretation and enables new perspectives. While the government dismantled Manzanar in an effort to forget their mistakes, they in turn enabled a deeper level of memorialization that bears heavily on both the present and the future. Thank you.